Welcome everybody to the Rumi Forum Luncheon. Today we have Dr. Ian Lesser. He's going to be speaking about US-Turkish relations and right off the completion of a very successful President Obama visit to Turkey. We will, Dr. Lesser will be speaking for 30 minutes and then we will entertain questions. And in the question and answer period, please stand up, introduce yourself and your organization, and Dr. Lesser will respond. Dr. Lesser.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you very much for this kind invitation to be here with you and to talk about US-Turkish relations at a very interesting time, obviously, for a lot of different reasons. I'm not sure if I have quite 30 minutes, but that maybe will leave us a little more time to discuss, which would be fine too. What I thought I'd do is maybe talk a little bit about the context, the background, you know, what was the problem, what are the opportunities in US-Turkish relations, and maybe say a little bit about the visit itself, how I see it and why it was important. I do think it was very important. And then maybe a bit about what can be done to build on the public diplomacy success of the visit. First on the context, I mean, there is a problem. There has been a problem in US-Turkish relations. In the proximate sense, it's been the problem of the last 8 years, which have been a very, very rough time in US-Turkish relations. The German Marshall Fund and others, Pew, have charted this. Public opinion in Turkey has become extremely negative, had become extremely negative about the United States. Sometimes it didn't get out of single digits positive views of the United States. So we had a big public diplomacy problem in Turkey, to be sure. Is that totally new? No, it's not totally new. There is a history of this in Turkey and in other places. But I think the difference is that in the last number of years, public opinion has really come to count in Turkish foreign policy. It may not have mattered in the same way that Turks had bouts of strong anti-Americanism in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. Perhaps it mattered in some ways, but it didn't matter in the same way, because today I think Turkey, very much like the rest of Europe, has become a place in which you just don't make foreign policy without reference to the public and public opinion. And especially for the AKP government, which is, you know, a populist movement, among other things, this really does count. So I think that's part of the problem that Obama would have gone to Turkey to fix, and I think he did a rather good job of making tremendous headway, I would say, on that. But that problem of the last 8 years has been very, very, very pronounced in Turkey, especially as a NATO ally. It surprised a lot of people to see those numbers so low. A couple of other things on the problem. There is a tendency to think, again, thinking about these last 8 years and how difficult they've been, especially since 2003 and Iraq, that this is something entirely new. That we, in the past, even in the Clinton administration in particular, I worked in the Clinton administration, I would like to be able to tell you that this was a golden age and that it was lost and that we can go back to it. The truth is, yes, I think it was a lot better. I think it can be a lot better, but there was never really a golden age in US-Turkish relations in that way. We went through, over decades, periods of real stress in the relationship, whether it was the Johnson letter in the 60s or a period after 1973-74 in Cyprus, where Turkey was under sanctions from the United States until 78, I believe. You know, we've had some really rough stretches in the relationship before, so it was never quite this golden age thing that people sometimes portray. I think that's one of the problems. So to kind of recalibrate the expectations is part of the problem here. Another problem I would talk about, I don't know if there's a map in this room, I guess there isn't, which is a good thing actually, I think, because I think part of the problem in talking about US-Turkish relations is that people look at the map too much on both sides. We talk in terms of a strategic partnership, and the first thing people do is turn to the map and say, look where Turkey is. You know, it sits astride. This is the typical vocabulary, the Balkans and Eurasia and the Middle East and Europe and all of this kind of thing, which is of course objectively true. And there is a lot going on Turkey's borders, and a lot of it matters to the United States. And that is a basic reason for thinking of Turkey as an important partner. But it only takes you so far. It's a kind of real estate vision of strategy based on location, 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 which isn't enough, actually. You also have to ask more difficult questions about whether we're actually on the same page in terms of our views of what's going on those areas around the map. And that's very often not been the case in previous decades. So that's part of it. Too much geopolitics, maybe too little actual policy coordination and understanding, which is never going to be perfect, obviously, but it could be better than it's been at points. But I think always using this imagery of bridges and the map and geopolitics sometimes doesn't help. So that's been another problem. I talked about public opinion, but of course it's not just about public opinion. And one of the things that has really struck me in visits to Turkey over the last years has been the deterioration of attitudes towards the United States among policymakers, among policy elites, among even sometimes commercial elites and cultural elites. People who you would think ought to know better when you ask about whether the United States is committed to Turkey's defense, or whether we take the partnership with Turkey seriously in NATO, or whether we want to revisit the Montreux Treaty, or all of these things that are sort of, pillars of concern in Turkey when you think about Turkish sovereignty and all of that. There's a lot of suspicion of the United States, and it's not just at the public level, it's also at the level of foreign ministry officials and others. That's a different kind of problem, but it's also part of this overall difficulty in the relationship that Obama went to Turkey having to fix in some way. Now let me just say a little bit about what he did do there. I think it was I really think the visit was a great success on a number of different levels. First of all, I think it's enormously significant that the president went. I mean, very early in an administration. It was only the second purely bilateral visit that the president made. The first was to Canada. I also think it's very important that it came as part of a European tour. I mean, this may seem to you as a bit of a German Marshall Fund of the United States perspective. After all, our mission is to promote transatlantic cooperation. Maybe, but I actually think it's significant. After all, the president could have gone to Turkey as part of a Middle Eastern tour. And just as a thought experiment, consider how very different the discussion about the visit would have been if it came at the end of a visit to Cairo and Amman and Jerusalem and Riyadh, etc. I mean, that would have been a very, very different kind of discussion. I think that's true, even though a lot of the issues that were discussed were obviously Middle Eastern or Eurasian issues. You know, he went to Turkey, having gone to London for the G20, having gone to Strasbourg for the NATO summit. It was in the context of a transatlantic discourse. And when the comparisons were made by the media and by others, say, well, how did it go in Turkey versus how it went in, it was versus how it went in Strasbourg or in London. So that was, I think, very much part of it and made a big difference. In any case, you know, the fact that the president went at a time of great economic stress and with a lot of other demands on his time is, I think, a big deal, actually. And there are going to be other visits coming from the Secretary of State. This is now multiple visits by the Secretary of State. You know, this is very important. I think that shows a different degree of commitment. How did the visit go itself? I think the visit went very well, as I said, at the public diplomacy level. The style was totally different. And I happen to believe the style really matters. You know, Clinton, at the level of the policy discourse with Turkey in the Clinton years, we had a lot of disagreements, actually, over some of the same issues we have disagreements over today, actually, over Iraq policy, over Cyprus, over the Armenian issue, over many things like that. But when Clinton went and gave his famous speech in Istanbul, and also to the Turkish parliament, but to the OSCE summit, I guess, in 1999, you know, this was a galvanizing thing and gave rise to a lot of this golden age expectation. You know, we simply got the public diplomacy right at that point. I think, you know, after 8 years of the Bush administration and a very tough time in foreign policy with America's partners, there was nothing that last administration was going to be able to do to fix the problem with Turkey, really. You could fix pieces of it sort of below the table on cooperation against the PKK or other things that mattered, but at the level of public acceptance and even this official suspicion, they were never going to fix the problem, in my view. It required a different style, and I do think At least as one can judge by this short visit, Obama managed to do that. He engaged with people. He gave the impression that we took Turkish interests and Turkey seriously, not just in a derivative way, not just because Turkey could be helpful to us on this or that, but because Turkey was an important partner for big projects. And that, whether it's energy or other things, but we admired Turkey. You know, he went there and he gave the impression that we admired Turkey as Turkey. So I think that was a great success. I think another piece of this success was that the president seemed to avoid a lot of potential pitfalls, things that are very difficult to talk about. You know, it is hard if you go to a NATO ally, a longtime partner, to start talking about things that refer to the internal affairs of another country. You have a potential minefield, and that's very difficult stuff, especially given the fact that Turkey has its own pretty overheated debate from time to time about its own identity and direction and orientation and politics and all the rest of it. And you just had an election, local elections. So, you know, Obama went into this, managed to say some significant things on the Kurdish issue, on relations with Armenia, that came off pretty well. I mean, my reading of the Turkish reaction was pretty positive to most of this. Sure, there was some criticism of parts of it, but given what could have come out of that kind of rhetoric, I mean, imagine had Bush gone there and given the same speech, I don't think the reaction would have been the same on this question of references to minorities and etc. Because people simply were primed to be critical, whereas in this case, I think people were rightly primed to be receptive to what Obama had to say. So he was able to step around some of those very difficult internal issues without a lot of problem. I personally think, stepping back from just the question of the visit now and just talking about U.S. policy, I think we do need to be careful about being too engaged in the internal affairs, especially of a NATO ally. I mean, I think we do need to have a certain respect for the internal life of partners. Do we have stakes? Do we have interests? Do we have preferred outcomes? Yes, we do. But should we be seen to be, should we run the risk of being perceived as interfering in someone else's, in the politics of an ally? I would be very careful about that. And I think over the last years we've skated very close to that problem. Turkey has its own difficult debates internally. We don't need to make them more difficult. So I think on that score it was quite a success. Now let me just finish by saying a few things about the future and areas where we can recalibrate the relationship. And I would really use that term specifically because I think part of the problem is that we've had expectations of each other that are unreasonable in a lot of ways. You know, we expect things from Turkey sometimes that Turkey is simply not going to be comfortable doing vis-a-vis Iraq or Iran or even Russia. I mean, Turkey has to live in these neighborhoods. Turkey has its own independent, sovereign interests. We need to be careful about that. Does it mean that we shouldn't make the point and try to convince Turkey to do this or that? No, it doesn't. But, you know, at the end of the day, we have to have reasonable expectations. Similarly, I think for Turks, there needs to be an understanding that viewed from Washington, the U.S. as a global power is simply not going to see the world in the same way as Turkey as an important regional power is going to see it. For Turks, understandably, Turkey and events around Turkey are at the center of the universe. Seen from Washington, it's not at the center of the universe. And probably this is a good thing, actually. We have multiple concerns, especially at this time of great economic stress. You know, there's Russia, there's China, issues of nuclear stability, all kinds of things that are existential problems for the United States. The management of the relationship with Turkey is extremely important, but it's not existential. And so I think when we look ahead, we need to sort of recalibrate and maybe reinvent some parts of the relationship where we can be truly helpful to each other. Now, let me just mention a couple of these things. Because I think if you imagine what Obama and his advisors would have been talking to their Turkish counterparts about in Ankara, the list looks similar from Washington or Ankara. The list is pretty well-known stuff. I mean, it's Iraq, it's BKK, it's the future of Iraq, it's Iran, it's Afghanistan, relations with Armenia, Russia, and so on, NATO affairs. But on each of, so we bring the same issues to the agenda. The question is, do we actually have the same priorities and concerns within those things? And there are big differences. So when we talk about Iraq, you know, for Turkey, it's all about containing the PKK problem and getting more assistance with that. Reassurances vis-a-vis the future of northern Iraq. For the United States, it's about to what extent can we rely on you to help us disengage from Iraq successfully, using Incirlik and other things like that. On Iran, I'm sure that the Turkish government was very keen to see whether the Obama administration was really committed to opening a strategic dialogue with Iran, because this would be very meaningful for Turkey. From an American perspective, I'm sure it was all about trying to get Turkey, as a UN Security Council member for this coming period, to be supportive in trying to deal with the nuclear program in Iran. It's a different, will Turkey take tough messages to Tehran or not? Again, it's the same issue, but different concerns. On Afghanistan, I think it's going to be very tough. It was very tough. It will be very tough for the United States to get any new troop commitments for combat purposes from Turkey, just as it will be for with other NATO allies. The public just isn't going to support it, and I think probably Turkey said quite rightly that Turkey has been supportive, takes the issue seriously, has been doing a lot since 2001, but we're not going to make further large-scale combat troop commitments to Afghanistan. That's essentially the message the Obama administration got in other European capitals. So that's not surprising. On Armenia and the Armenian genocide resolution question, I'm quite struck that compared to previous years, even with this change of administration and even with the rhetoric and the opinions and so on that will be different and things that are brought to the table, people are taking a bit of a low-key attitude to this. This is my perception. And I think the center of gravity for this issue now is quite rightly on the question of Turkish-Armenian détente and whether it's possible that the border can be opened between Turkey and Armenia. And I think probably the Obama message in Turkey was exactly that. Well, it was in his speech, but I think in private as well, it was probably exactly about that. I don't think the administration went to Turkey with its mind made up about how it would treat this issue domestically in the United States, coming up on these critical dates in April. I don't think so, and I'm not even sure they've made up their mind already. So this remains to me an open question, and I think the center of gravity for it is still very much this question of what happens between Turkey and Armenia. Just one or two other things and then I'll stop. I think there are some things where we can be very helpful with each other, but we need to rethink how we approach these issues. NATO affairs. The discussion in Turkey during the Obama visit was apparently, and in the run-up to it, was apparently all about the NATO Secretary General, Rasmussen, and Turkey's objections to his nomination as the next Secretary General of NATO. Perhaps the AKP government felt itself under particular pressure to be tough on this issue, having just gone through an election, local elections, which it found at least somewhat disappointing, perhaps, the result. Whatever it is, I'm not sure Turkey was ever really likely to veto Rasmussen's nomination. I mean, Turkey has a strong stake, maybe the strongest stake of any NATO member in alliance cohesion, and to sort of break that, to jeopardize it at a very critical period, I think would be a mistake. But naturally, Turkey had its preferences, and Turkey made them known. I think there are some much bigger issues about NATO that are coming that we've neglected. NATO has started a new discussion about its strategic concept, not just who is a member of NATO and the whole enlargement thing, which has dominated the agenda for the last years, but actually what NATO does and where it does it. And this is critical for Turkey. I mean, Turkey has an extraordinary concentration of challenges, security challenges, on its borders. It needs reassurance and deterrence with regard to these things. NATO can provide that. But there's going to be a reinvention of NATO, and it's not at all clear what comes out over the next couple of years. Turkey is going to be a key stakeholder in that with the United States. So that's a discussion we need to have much more seriously, I think, with Turkey. Future of NATO. How we as the United States, talk to Europe about Turkey's EU candidacy. I mean, this is a kind of symbolic must in the relationship. There are very good reasons for the United States to be supportive, and Obama went out of his way to reiterate this. But of course, that's a totally uncontroversial thing to say. Every U.S. administration is going to be supportive of Turkey's EU candidacy. The question is, how do we make this point to Europeans in ways that make a difference? It was one thing to do it at the beginning of the process, to make big strategic arguments, to point at the map. But that's not enough anymore. There's European public opinion. There are other things that are very much involved. We need to find a different way to talk to Europe about Turkey and its candidacy that doesn't turn Europeans off, that is useful and attractive and appropriate now that Turkey is a candidate and moving along or not in very detailed legal and political ways with Europe. That's a harder thing for us to do. I think it'll help because the Obama administration surely is going to have a better relationship with Europe than its predecessor did, and that helps us make the case. One final point is about the economy, the global economy. I think this has the potential to change everything. I don't want to be too pessimistic. I am not an economist. But there's every sign that this is going to be a very long, very deep, and very pronounced crisis affecting everybody in different phases. And you begin to see this now quite dramatically in Turkey. So much of what Turkey has been about, in my view, and so much of how others have seen Turkey in the last years has been driven by high growth rates, quite evident prosperity since the 2001 crisis in Turkey. And it's driven a lot of things, from Turkey's much greater activism in its neighborhood, much of which is commercial, to the way it's seen by key partners like Russia or the EU. I mean, imagine, if we have a deep, profound economic crisis, how is this going to help the EU project for Turkey? I don't think so. Is it going to make it easier for the United States to spend time managing the relationship with Turkey? Probably not. Is it going to make societies around Turkey behave in a better way? Probably not. The mood of rising nationalism and anti-globalization and all of these things, whether it's in Russia or the Balkans or the Middle East, I think this could get much tougher. So we need to think through together, I think, the consequences of this economic crisis and what it means for the relationship. I didn't want to end on a pessimistic note, because I really think the whole thing is poised for a different kind of relationship with a lot of new opportunities. It may not be the golden age that people have been talking about on both sides in the run-up to the trip. I think that rhetoric is maybe a bit high-flown and creates expectations we can't meet. But I do think there are a lot of new opportunities there, and this visit set the tone to do some new things. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lesser, for hitting upon the main points in Turkey's future and the future of the U.S.-Turkish relationship. I apologize, I didn't introduce myself at the very beginning. My name is Günay Evinç. I'm the president-elect of the Assembly of Turkish American Associations, which is the umbrella organization for around 60 local organizations. Also, I'm a lawyer in international law and a Fulbrighter in international law. I just returned from Turkey, and about a week ago today, when I got off the plane, got into the taxi, I said to the taxi driver, "How are things going?" He said, "Obama was great." And then I got into another taxi to go to the U.S. consulate, and I said, "How's it going?" And he says, "Obama was great." Abi, which means brother, this man is sympathetic, which has a different meaning in Turkish than in English, meaning that we like his nature, his personality. I got the same feedback from the more elite groups as well, the cultural elite, the political elite, because I participated in a conference on Turkish entrepreneurs. 2,000 of them from around the world got together in Istanbul. And there is no bad news. the new Turkish mindset, from Kürşat Tüzmen, the minister, to Rifat Hizarçıklıoğlu, the TOBB president, to the Prime Minister's cabinet, are looking at everything as an opportunity. And this is universal among everybody, regardless of their political orientations. We recognized in the president's speech a concept of which we call constructive ambiguity, which is to construe the ambiguities to one's favor or disfavor, depending on whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, or if you're a schizophrenic or confident in yourself and the future. And what we realized is when we practice constructive ambiguity with a positive perspective, that there are excellent opportunities ahead. We're going to answer ask some questions, and we kindly ask that you please answer them for our audience. But I would like to hit upon two things that I noticed. One was the president said, this is a terrorist organization, PKK will work against it. On the other hand, he said Turkey should talk to its Kurdish leaders. This, for the Turkish-American mainstream and intellectual world, meant that Turkey will not be speaking to leaders who are terrorists. Secondly, the president said he has his own personal opinions about the Armenian situation. And then there is that of course, the thoughts of the United States. Putting his personal thoughts aside, he said the thoughts and the interests of the United States shall govern. And that was interpreted that way too. Everyone can have their personal opinions, but there is, again, at the end, a legal definition and a political reality. Those were my two observations in Turkey in the past week on interpretation on these two critical points. Ladies and gentlemen, if you can please stand and, when you're asking a question, introduce yourself and your organization for the group here, and Dr. Lesser will respond. Sonay.
Thank you very much for your talk. My name is Sonay Kanber. I'm also a Fulbright scholar from Turkey. I work with Mr. Ewing, and I'm an ATA volunteer. I also definitely agree with you that Mr. Obama managed to do very well in terms of public diplomacy. But my question is on the coverage of mainstream U.S. media of President Obama's Turkey visit. I think the mainstream coverage was not good enough, because we heard many things like Obama is visiting, it's the first visit to an Islamic country, Muslim country, predominantly Muslim country. On CNN we heard things like, oh, President Obama met with the Muslim youth, many other things. Are we losing Turkey? It's being governed by an Islamic government since 2002. These all come from MSNBC, CNN, and etc., not even Fox News. Yet, when President Obama held a town hall meeting in Strasbourg, the rhetoric was not like, our president is meeting with the Christian youth from Germany and from France. The counter-argument to that is, when I talk to my American friends, they say, oh, well, but this is very good, because in American public perception, you show a country, you show Hagia Sophia, which is a museum right now, you show these young Turkish students asking very good questions and etc. But to me, the portrayal was not very good, and it was not portrayed as though Turkey is a European country or a candidate to European membership. What are your thoughts on that? Well,
I mean, it's a good question, and I agree with a lot of the tenor of it. If you look at the coverage of Turkey in the United States, not just surrounding the visit, but actually the coverage in general, I mean, this is a traditional problem. I mean, as far as the U.S. media is concerned, for the most part, Turkey is in the Middle East. What is interesting about Turkey and the engagement in Turkey for the U.S. media has been this Muslim Western aspect of the relationship. This is how it's been treated for a very, very long time. Is it entirely useful to do that? I don't actually think so. I would say, though, to go back to the point that I was making, imagine how much worse the problem would be, and you're quite right to identify it, but I mean how much worse the problem would be if the visit was part of a Middle Eastern tour. I really do think this would send absolutely the wrong signal. What the administration, I think, was quite careful not to use any of this model rhetoric. Model for the Muslim world, moderate Muslim model, all of this model stuff, which was extremely unpopular in Turkey and was in some ways quite meaningless, because I think it tends to reduce to meaninglessness the idea that countries have their own specificities and their own, that they're important in their own right. Turkey is a very interesting place with its own distinctive history, traditions, approaches, etc., orientation. But I think it's somewhat inevitable that this media coverage is always drawn back to these issues of identity and orientation in Turkey, not least because this is the message that you get from watching Turkey's own media debate about itself. And so, you have, it's not as if Turkey is covered every day. I mean, there are journalists in the room who know much more about this, but it's not as if Turkey in the U.S. media is covered every day. It's not as if there's an ongoing debate about Turkey. There is a periodic debate about Turkey. That's not true for Turkey watchers, perhaps, and there are many of them in Washington. Very close understandings, but also very strong views. And, so if you come to do some coverage of Turkey every 6 months, and you reach out to the same people who are normally doing this debate, which can get very heated about Turkey's orientation, yes, you're going to get a lens of interpretation about Turkey that is very much about these kinds of issues of religion and identity that you're talking about. From a foreign policy analyst perspective, I would much prefer that the discussion about Turkey be about what we're doing together on this issue or in this place, rather than these other questions. I'm not sure we're ever going to fix this problem, I would say.
Sir.
Ali Abu Zakuk, Managing Editor of Democracy Watch, the Center for the Study of Islamic Democracy. I think, just to elaborate, to appreciate your presentation, but also to see that when President Obama visited Turkey, he really gave also some kind of an approval of the democracy that is developing there. Telling the Muslim world, or telling the Europeans both ways, that democracy and religion, in Turkey it is the Muslim religion, are not necessarily to be against each other. I think that message was clear in his statement, and I think he was very appropriately when they said that in the first 100 years he would speak in a message to the Muslim world, and choosing Turkey, even though he supported Turkey's membership in the AU, with the hesitance of the Europeans. What does the Americans have to do with us? They shouldn't interfere. But as you said, I think he has created a good clout with the European presidency that his approval and his encouragement will have a say. But the question that he really emphasizes there, speaking to the Turkish parliament or speaking to the Turkish youth and so on, was, I think, very significant, that he chose among all the 1.5 Muslims in the world, billion Muslims in the world, the country that is really an established democracy, that has brought itself together, worked together with its culture, worked together as a modern state that can have a representative government. What do you say about that?
Well, I think there are a couple of things that go on when you have a presidential visit of that kind, which is so high profile, and at a time when the president obviously isn't going to be making a lot of foreign trips. You have to do a bit of everything on these stops. And I think there had been this discussion. Yes, there was supposed to be a visit to a country in the Muslim world in the first 100 days of the administration. They did that. It happened to be Turkey. I think it happened to be Turkey largely because it happened to coincide with these other things which were very important and the president needed to go to. And yes, it was important that he chose to extend the trip and go to Turkey. But I don't think if you were to ask the administration this question, they would say that this is the place they chose to make this major address to the Muslims. Eventually, I think that will come in other ways. Or maybe perhaps they don't need to do it that way. They could make 6 different addresses to the Muslim world from different perspectives, from different places. I think that's probably more likely and maybe even a better idea. So I think they're trying to accomplish a bunch of different things, and it's sometimes very difficult to reconcile them because different audiences are looking for different messages. And the president has a huge megaphone. Every word is parsed. Everything is taken apart and examined, and that's quite natural. But sometimes I think the analysis can get more sophisticated than it probably is warranted. You know, to take what did he mean by model for a strategic what did it mean that he didn't use this other? Well, some of that is useful, but you can take it too far. I think it's enough to sort of say he accomplished a number of different things in this trip with Turkey in a very successful way, but the style is what made it work. The style is what made it work, because any of those messages, whether it was about Turkey and Europe or Turkey's democracy or other things, or even talking to youth, it just would not have worked as well with some other politicians we can think of. So I think that's kind of the glue in the end that makes it all work. I mean, the comments about Turkey and Europe, for example, did provoke a fairly strong response from President Sarkozy. I mean, there is a limit. I mean, even though the French-U.S. relationship now is as good as it's been for a very long time, there's still issues where we're not going to see eye to eye. We're not going to make Europe transform its attitudes about Turkey and Europe. That may happen over time as a result of what Europe becomes and what Turkey does, but we're not going to change that equation, in my view. We should make the case, of course, I think, and do it in a smart way, but it's not going to be transformative.
My name's Dan Lieberman. Yeah, the one issue that I think bothers the world concerning Turkey is Cyprus. It's sort of under the radar now, but it's a strong humanitarian issue, and I was wondering if you can update us on what is the status of Cyprus concerning Turkey and Greece, and just tell us, is there a possibility of some reconciliation?
I think there are a number of different things going on there. I think, there are a few things that are happening at once. There is a need for there to be some movement on the Cyprus issue to meet certain EU-imposed deadlines that have to do with Turkey's candidacy and the opening or closure of different chapters that need to happen in 2009. And so that is not, I don't think it creates an utter train wreck if Turkey misses those deadlines that have to do with opening of ports to Cypriot traffic and so on, airports and ports to Cypriot traffic. Ultimately, it means, whether Turkey will recognize the Republic of Cyprus, because, you can't join the European Union if you don't recognize all the members. But that's a longer-term issue. The nearer-term thing is whether the dynamics on the island could actually facilitate a settlement, which people have been striving for decades. I think most people who look at this say that the conditions over the last year have been about as good as they've ever been. Because you had leaderships on both sides of the island who were much more amenable to coming to a solution. They were ideologically compatible. They were willing to do it as a Cypriot solution with other parties, including Turkey and Greece and the United States, and the EU is in a way secondary. And on the face of it, you would say that's all very, very positive. Whether they can actually go that last step and get an agreement signed and get it passed, because it would have to go to a referenda in the island in a way that the Annan plan some years ago wasn't able to do, is anyone's guess. I find very few people who are optimistic, but also a lot of people who feel that it's really quite tragic because the situation is in a way almost there. I think the good news about Cyprus is that because the situation on the island between the communities is very different than it used to be. You don't any longer have a security problem, a security dispute on Cyprus. You have a political dispute. People are not killing each other on Cyprus. People are not threatening to kill each other on Cyprus. You've had an ability to go back and forth across the Green Line in Cyprus with hundreds of thousands, perhaps more visits across the line over the last years virtually without an incident, as far as I understand it. This is very, very significant. But it does also mean that, seen from Washington, this issue doesn't have the priority that it used to. And it used to be a critical issue. Not just the issue of Cyprus, but Greek-Turkish relations. This was one of the great animating issues for U.S. involvement in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's not anymore. I doubt it was even on the agenda when Obama was in Cyprus this time around. That's a transforming thing. It's largely positive. It includes the détente that's grown up between Athens and Ankara. It's not just about Cyprus. But is it a settlement? No, it's not a settlement. And unless you do get a settlement on Cyprus and a different attitude, a lot of other bigger picture questions and strategic interests for Turkey, like joining Europe formally, are not going to be possible. So I think it's a mix. I'm not actually optimistic in the short term, but I think if we take a long view about how the situation has changed, there's been a lot of progress.
Yes, this one in the back first, and then you, Qasim.
I'm Cynthia Butler. I'm just an attorney in town, and I was wondering if there were going to be any sort of follow-up missions in terms of trade missions or commercial détente that would strengthen the ties.
U.S.-Turkey.
Yes. In the near future.
Well, there will be. These things are going on all the time. I mean, for some time, Turkey has been designated a big emerging market by the Commerce Department, and the economic side of the relationship has been something that successive administrations have actually tried to strengthen. And I think over the last years, you've had a government in Turkey that is particularly attuned to this part of Turkey's foreign relations, the kind of soft power side of it as opposed to other things. So I don't think that's going to change. I think there was a lot of let me put it another way. I mean, someone referred earlier to this question of losing Turkey and so on. I mean, this has been very prominent in the debate in Washington among strategic circles for the last years. Are we losing Turkey? Is Turkey lost? Who lost Turkey? All of this kind of thing. If you went to Wall Street, until recently, if you went to Wall Street and asked the same question about Turkey, people would say, what's the problem? No one's losing Turkey. It's a great emerging market. It's growing at 6 to 7% a year. This is a very interesting place to be. No one's losing Turkey. Quite the opposite. Now, of course, the economic crisis changes all of this, unfortunately, because there's a flight from risk, and emerging markets are seen as more risk-prone, even the better ones and the more dynamic places like Turkey. So there's a little less interest, and of course the ability to fund such things from the United States and foreign direct investment, which is growing very rapidly in Turkey, is now not, is slowing down, obviously. So the opportunities to work on this part of the relationship, which have been quite underdeveloped, are unfortunately probably shrinking a bit in the current climate. But I think for the long term, it is one of the great areas where we need to do more. We've had too much emphasis on the security and defense aspects of the relationship for understandable reasons, but that needs to be augmented, I think, by more on the economic side and on the cultural side. And if the economic scene permits, much more can be done. So I think there is a lot going on, but there will be constraints.
Hi, I am Qasim Jindemir. I read your paper, and the most striking part to me was the part on Incirlik.
Ah, yes.
You're calling for discussions for the future uses of Incirlik. Now, can you tell me what's the problem with the current status? Why are there frustrations on both sides? And why should we discuss this at this point?
Mm-hmm. First of all, thank you for reading it. Thank you for the question. I'm glad you noticed that, because I thought it was important to raise in this. We have the German Marshall Fund has a series called On Turkey that comes out roughly every 2 weeks with 3 different contributors, 2 in Turkey and myself. And the last piece that I wrote talked a little bit in the end about having a more open discussion with Turkey, a direct discussion with Turkey about what we do with Incirlik Air Base, which of course is a Turkish base. It's a Turkish facility which the United States is permitted to use for certain purposes. In a way, there are two pieces to this. There are the NATO uses of the base, which are not very controversial, really. And then there's the, because rarely tested, and then there are the bilateral uses of the base, and that's much more controversial. As I understand it, Turkish law does not permit the permanent stationing of foreign military forces on Turkish soil. And we've lived with that for a very long time. So everything that's done at Incirlik is done in a kind of rotating way, or it's defined in a way that doesn't make it permanent. But you can live with that as well. We have a status of forces agreement, but that is a rather legal technical document that deals with how you treat the assets and people who work at Incirlik. That sometimes has been a bit controversial, but these aren't the big problems. The big problems come when there is a crisis in the region and the United States has expectations about using Incirlik Air Base for the purposes of power projection. And this has been a problem over Iraq since 2003, where Turkey has in fact quietly permitted the United States to do a lot logistically from Incirlik, but not in terms of offensive air operations in Iraq. It was also a problem for the Clinton administration. Turkey has been unkeen to see the United States use the base for those kinds of purposes. So to me, it seems that if we are going to try, we, meaning on both sides, are going to bring out this issue of Incirlik every time we discuss the strategic relationship, and put this at the center of our debate, as it's very often the center, we need to be much clearer about what we can actually do, so we have some predictability. And those uses have to be reasonable uses. My own preference would be to see, first of all, much more use made of the base in a NATO context rather than a bilateral context. It's a lot less controversial, and I think it reinforces things that both of us would like to see. Because I'd like to see NATO pay more attention to problems in the South and in the Mediterranean, in the European space. That's one. The other is, you know, surely there are things that we can do from Incirlik that contribute to managing new security problems that are of importance to Turkey. Maritime security, ballistic missile defense, but not in this global intercontinental way, but rather reassuring Turkey, protecting Turkey against risks that already exist to Turkish territory from Syria, from Iran, etc. You know, there are a lot of different kinds of things, training, new kinds of training for security in the region that could be done from Incirlik. I think we, in any case, need to have a much more explicit discussion about what we actually do with this. If we're going to put this at the center of the discussion, we ought to know what we're talking about. Because if we look at the history of the last years, there's been a lot of disappointment and irritation on both sides over this question of how we use it or don't use Incirlik. So that's the kind of discussion I was trying to suggest we should open.
Yes, sir. And then
Hi, Ermal Hidayk, graduate student, University of Maryland. Now it's pretty clear that in the past 10 years or so, Turkey has had a very different approach to foreign policy. You can call it portfolio diversification, you can call it you know, different openings and so on and so forth. It's also clear that as regards different aspects of this new foreign policy, which has which focuses on a number of areas, which is European Union, the Balkans, Caucasus, Middle East, Russia, and so on and so forth. Now, it's also pretty obvious that some aspects of this foreign policy orientation has been brought into the discussion, are we losing Turkey, right? Now, it would also be obvious that President Obama's last visit showed that they regard this new orientation of Turkey as an asset rather than a liability. So that should, in my opinion, end that discussion. Apparently Turkey is not lost, but is as much a strategic partner as ever. Now, having said that, do you see in the long run any clash or any potential frictions that could stem because of this new orientation? Say the relationship between Turkey and Russia, which, you know, it would appear that the foreign direct investment between the two countries is in the tens of billions of dollars
Sure.
right now, and so on. So, which particular points would you think are hot points of friction between
Sure.
Russia, between Turkey and the United States in the future?
Yeah, no, I mean it's a very good question, and I agree with the basic principle that you're setting out. That Turkish foreign policy has changed in some very fundamental ways. It's a lot more active. It's a lot more diverse. I mean, this notion of portfolio diversification is actually a very good way to describe it. There is a kind of new look in Turkish foreign policy. It is a lot more Middle Eastern and Eurasian than it used to be, or more balanced. This has different explanations. I think in part it's simply that the government Turkey has at the moment is a lot more comfortable working in those places, in those areas, than its predecessors were. It's not just about that. It's about commercial opportunities. It's about energy. There are a lot of things going on there. So it's different. Turkey is more active, more engaged. Now, the question from an American, US-Turkish point of view, is this good news or bad news? Well, I think I agree again with your interpretation, which is that it potentially can be an important asset for the United States. I don't think it's bad news. But I would ask two serious questions. One has to do with priorities. The list, if you talk to key foreign policy advisors in Ankara, they will give you a list rather like the one you just gave. It's very long, of places where Turkey is becoming more active. And it also extends to Africa and China, and a lot of this is commercial engagement, but a lot of it is also political engagement. There is a sense that Turkey can do all of these things at once. So, you know, it can be active in the Middle East, it can play a broker's role in the peace process, it can work with Russia and China and open new embassies in Africa, and also have its EU project and be active in NATO and US-Turkish relations, don't forget that. And, you know, so you've got this huge menu, global menu of places and issues and so on, which is fine under conditions of high prosperity, low controversy over these issues, not a lot of specific threats other than the very direct one in northern Iraq and so on. Are we going to have the luxury of that kind of environment in the future? Maybe not. It's harder to conduct that kind of foreign policy when your economy is shrinking at 5 or 6% a year. I know this official is maybe 3.5%. I hope Turkish officials are right. Certainly ours is shrinking faster than that. That's one constraint. But the other constraint is simply this question of political energy. You know, what do policymakers spend their time doing? Can you really be equally serious about the EU candidacy and relations with the United States and the relationship with Russia and engagement in the Middle East and all of these other things at the same time? And even if you can do all of those, what are your priorities? So, not surprisingly, from my point of view, sitting in Washington, I would like to hear that the EU project and NATO and the relationship with the United States is still at least up near the top of the list. So that's problem number one, you know, priorities. Problem number two is that, as you quite rightly say, on specific issues, as Turkey becomes more active and has greater stakes with Russia and in the Middle East as well, the potential for disagreement with the United States, it may not grow, but it becomes more consequential. Russia is a very good example of this. The Georgia crisis was a very good flashpoint in that regard. I mean, Turkey is obviously going to see these kinds of regional issues in the Black Sea and the Caucasus, for example, in a very different way than we are. We're going to view it from the United States in terms of the broad gauge strategic relationship with Russia. Which is not easy for the United States. Turkey has much more proximate stakes that are economic and also have to do with its own regional prerogatives. So there is potential for friction there. Can it be managed? I think it can. Absolutely think it can. But it presupposes that we have a open and much better dialogue on a lot of this stuff before the fact, and don't just wait for crises like Georgia to provoke it. Another example would be the Middle East peace process, the relationship with Israel, Israel-Palestinian relations, and you only have to look at the Gaza crisis recently to see the potential there. We do not see, as societies, this problem in the same ways. We have a shared stake in its resolution. We understand there is a human tragedy. We have a political and strategic stake in the outcome. But in terms of our affinities, in terms of our preferences on a day-to-day basis, they are not the same. You could argue that some of Turkey's views about Hamas and about the situation in Gaza are in fact much closer to European mainstream views about this, that the United States is in some ways the outlier here. But nonetheless, the reality is still there, that we're not exactly on the same page when it comes to this kind of thing. So it's another area where we can have very severe differences if we're not careful.
Okay, we have two final questions.
Hi, thanks so much. Haley Cook with SETA Foundation. And my question is about the Caucasus Stability and Cooperation Platform, and I'm going to frame it in a way that we're not getting too far from US-Turkish relations. So my question is, I mean, from the regional standpoint, grievances from Central Asia is that this platform is going to exclude certain countries, and that it is a replacement for already existing mechanisms, and that the idea wouldn't be to cooperate with the OSCE and the EU and bring in these big players in the region. And really my question is, where do you see this slowly moving platform? Where do you see that the energy, as you were talking about political energy and how much can Turkey afford, where do you see their energies pushed on this? And also, as Central Asia becomes a little bit more on the Washington radar, how do you see the U.S. becoming a little bit more interested in supporting the platform in the future in terms of our own strategic interests?
I mean, it's a good series of questions. I mean, I'm not an expert on this initiative, but I can give you just some reactions. I think, in a way, this kind of initiative is very much of a piece with Turkey's foreign policy behavior over the last years. You know, this idea that, you know, it's a kind of yes we can approach to regional affairs that is played out in a lot of different settings, whether it's that or the relationship between Israel and Syria, where Turkey has played a role. You know, Turkey would like to play a role between Iran and the United States, for example. I think some of this is realistic, some of it is not realistic. In the case of the Black Sea and the Caucasus, I think there's no objective reason why this kind of an effort should be incompatible with U.S. interests and why it can't produce some good results. I think you have to take two things into account, though, when you do this. I mean, one is, yeah, you really do have big partners with big stakes who want to be informed and don't want to be surprised. The United States, the EU, Russia, others. So there is a certain wariness about this. It can be managed with very skillful diplomacy. Turkey has very skillful diplomats. But it's something to be careful about. The other thing is that it's fine to have these kinds of initiatives, but you also have to be willing to spend the political capital to fix some of the problems. And, you know, here obviously I'm talking about the relationship between Turkey and Armenia. I mean, it's really, I think, quite unrealistic to conceive of a framework of the kind that was proposed during the Georgia crisis really becoming effective if Turkey is not willing and not able to construct a détente with Armenia. That also doesn't isolate Azerbaijan, etc. But these are big problems that require different kinds of very high-grade, very costly political commitments. I think it would be worth it for Turkey to do that, but I think that kind of a framework will be more effective if it has as its core that kind of a, you know, a commitment from Turkey to actually transform some of the key relationships.
One last question.
Rumi Forum. You mentioned that U.S. government must keep far from Turkey's domestic politics, but not as a policymaker, but as a scholar. Do you think the internal affairs of Turkey and the U.S.-Turkish relations are totally separate from each other, or do they have impacts on each other?
Well, they're not totally separate in the sense that we are both societies extremely keen watchers of, especially Turks, I would say, are very keen watchers of what happens here. So, you know, no one is in a way isolated from what happens inside our society. But I think you probably meant the question more the other way around in terms of kind of internal debates in Turkey and how it's seen here. Inevitably, there is going to be a little bit of this, what I would call inside-out approach to relations with Turkey. It's not just with Turkey. This happens in a lot of places. You know, in other words, not just looking at the foreign policy behavior and diplomacy and diplomatic interactions, but also looking at what's going on inside the society and how it affects the relationship with the United States. So a bit of this is unavoidable. People are obviously going to be interested, especially those who watch Turkey closely in the United States, interested in where Turkey is going internally, not just in terms of its parliamentary politics, but also in terms of the economy and the society and other things like that. So I don't think we can ignore that. I think where we have to be careful is imagining that the United States has leverage over the evolution of Turkish society and politics. I don't believe we do have very much leverage. I think we have to be very careful that we're not seen as interfering in Turkey's internal affairs, because I would say almost all sectors in Turkish society object to that. For different reasons perhaps, but at a certain level, because of Turkey's history, and perceptions, are very sensitive to this issue. So that's where I think we need to be careful. Do we take this into account? Do we want to understand what's happening as analysts? And do policymakers perhaps have preferences? Absolutely. Absolutely, we will have preferences. But there is a line between that and believing that somehow we can or should shape internal politics in Turkey. And there I think we can get ourselves into a lot of trouble. Thank you.
Dr. Lesser, thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thanks.